Sylvia, thank you very much for joining our conference and vindicating my support by actually showing up. I really appreciate that in this difficult COVID environment. Can you just talk a little bit about Aqua Bounty and I guess the genetic development of Aqua Advantage and the opportunity that it provides in fish farming, land-based fish farming?
Absolutely. Thank you, Kevin. It's wonderful to see you again. We've made quite a bit of progress, but let me give a little background to those that are listening. Aqua Bounty started 30 years ago when a researcher in Canada took an Atlantic salmon and modified it with a gene from a Chinook salmon. And the objective of that modification was actually animal welfare. What he wanted to be able to do is create an Atlantic salmon that could survive changes in climatic conditions. Because what happens with salmon is that when it's too cold or too warm, they're like the three bears, they don't eat. And so they don't grow. And what he wanted to do was create the opportunity in their early vulnerable stages that they would continue to eat. So that was the original genetic modification that took place. And we've been breeding that salmon conventionally for 30 years. So the construct is still the same one that went into place 30 years ago. Now we come to today, and there's probably never been a more ideal time to bring our salmon, our Aqua Advantage salmon, to market, and in particular with the way that we farm it. And so I think, as you know, we use a system called recirculating aquaculture systems in a land-based farm. They're big tanks under roof. And the benefit that our salmon creates with that type of farming is really twofold. We're able to get more throughput for the same dollar of investment, and our fish are really efficient in the way that they operate or they process their feed. And so from an environmentally sustainable perspective, we actually are improving the way that fish are farmed in a way that our salmon create a tremendous advantage from a financial feasibility perspective. And so the combination of those two types of technology, our ability to operate those land-based recirculating aquaculture systems, and our salmon, which are perfectly designed to thrive in that environment, brings us to today.
So you touched on a couple of things that are, I think, really important aspects of the value proposition that Aqua Bounty presents. And, you know, one is obviously the feed conversion, where salmon appear to be far ahead of chicken, pork, and beef, right, in feed conversion. So you get every dollar out of it with maximum efficiency. And then, interestingly enough, right, you avoid transportation costs by being able to present protein near the end market. But before we, I guess, get in a little deeper on that, can we just take a step back and maybe, Sylvia, you could present sort of the main problem, right, which is fisheries and the fact that they're thin and population growth and demand for more protein in general?
Yes, I think you've raised some really critical issues that we face globally. The first is we're going to have 9 billion people on the planet, and we've got to find a way to feed them, which means not our traditional methods aren't going to be enough. And as that population grows, what we see is diet shift to more protein. And so we're going to need to double protein supply in the next 30 years, doubling. That's quite a jump. Now, aquaculture is going to play a significant role in supplying that demand, that ever increasing demand. But we're constrained in terms of the way that salmon is produced today. Or 90% of the world's fisheries for salmon are overfished, and that's according to the FAO State of the World's Fisheries and Aquaculture report in 2020. So we're not going to be able to pull more fish out of the ocean because we want to protect those populations. And then when you get to net pens, which is the traditional method of farming Atlantic salmon, we're constrained there as well from a couple different perspectives. One, environmentally, the countries where those companies operate or offshore are reluctant to grant additional licenses because of the environmental impact. But I think just as importantly, that method of farming creates vulnerabilities for the fish. We talked about climatic conditions. As we think about climate change, we're seeing the oceans get warmer. That means the fish don't eat. It also exposes them to different types of diseases and predators. And so you're seeing challenges with continuous supply, which is why we think that land-based farms, the way that we operate them, are going to be able to fill that gap between supply and demand, because we're seeing demand grow at 5 to 7% a year and supply not able to keep up.
Right. So when you look out, say, over the next 5 to 10 years, how do you see that balance changing from, sea pens and offshore fishing versus land-based?
Well, I think that, for the first time, we actually have the ability to make those land-based systems financially viable. And in particular with our fish, because of the economic advantages that I'd like David to just give a top line of. But before he does, I think because you can put them in geographies that are net importers, so you're now creating the opportunity to have domestic supply. And I think as you know, one of the challenges we faced with COVID was the supply chains really demonstrated how fragile they are. And so domestic production capability is increasingly important as a food security issue to countries around the world. And, when you think about big economies like the US, like China, like, Brazil, they want to be self-sufficient in a healthy protein like salmon. So David, why don't you talk about why we believe that our fish and our method of farming, the time is really now to provide, to make this a viable alternative to net pens.
Absolutely. Thanks, Sylvia. Well, there are a number of advantages that we have financially in farming Aqua Advantage salmon versus conventional Atlantic salmon. And obviously, the biggest one for us is the faster growth rate for our salmon. We can grow from egg to harvest size in roughly 18 months. And that compares very favorably against conventional Atlantic salmon that can reach harvest size in about 28 months. And even that's an advantage over net pen production, which can take as long as 36 months. But that differential that we have, the 18 months versus 28 months, allows us to produce 70% more salmon in the same time period. So that translates into 70% more revenue, obviously, on an annual basis. Now, in addition to that, our fish are more efficient in converting the feed that they eat into size of the salmon itself. So what we have is a 25% feed efficiency ratio. So we're reducing feed cost over the life of the salmon by 25%. And feed happens to be the largest single variable expense component of growing a salmon to harvest size. Now, in addition to that, because we're producing more salmon every year, we're also available to spread our fixed costs over more output. So the combination of more volume, which is more revenue, plus a lower cost structure, allows us to have an EBITDA for farming our salmon that's twice as large as the EBITDA for farming conventional Atlantic salmon.
So, Sylvia, you touched on an important point, I think, that might not resonate, right? And it's really the length of time that Aqua Bounty has been around and all the investment that has gone into it over the past 3 decades, right? You're in a position now that you're not only very familiar with the genetic handling of this very special fish, but you're also very familiar with how to bring it to full size. So what's not evidently clear, in my personal opinion, are the number of facilities that you operate and the focus for each one and how it provides a springboard for growth in the future.
Great. So as you know, we operate a small facility in Canada, 250 metric tons, and we have our Indiana facility, which is 1,200 metric tons, which is actually one of the largest in the world that's in current operation and harvesting fish. That being said, we are actually at an inflection point and in terms of building out growth and expansion of our business for the future. You know, it took us 25 years to get regulatory approval. And, you know, we've invested in the farm in Indiana so that we could demonstrate the financial viability of Aqua Advantage and our ability to operate that type of a facility profitably. And so Indiana is an excellent proof point. But the real opportunity for us is to build a large scale from, you know, latest technology farm that would be roughly 10,000 metric tons of production. So almost 10 times the size of the facility that we operate in Indiana. And as David said, you know, it's a longer term investment, but critically important to filling that gap between supply and demand. And with our expertise in operating these types of facilities, we really think that there's no one out there that can do it as effectively as we can. And so the plan is we're building the plan for project financing for that next farm in the U.S. We've identified a site. We've got an engineering team working on it. We've identified the technology that we'll be using. So that is the next phase of our growth and expansion plan.
So I'd be remiss, Sylvia, I think, if I left this one important point out. Now, you know, I've been following the company now for, I guess, the better part of 3 years, more or less. And there's a major change at the CEO level. And that was you coming in. And I think it's critically important for people to understand, investors particularly, how important it is to make that transition. It's one thing to have this genetic modification and another thing to prove that you can grow it at a commercial level. But it's even more important to make it clear that you'll be able to address the end market. And I was wondering if you wouldn't mind, please, indulging me in just taking a couple of minutes to make it clear about the experience that you bring and the changes that you've made at the senior level to ensure that, yes, once we're able to deliver, 1,200 metric tons of Aqua Advantage salmon, we'll be able to build the next plant and we'll be able to deliver all of that to the market.
So thank you, Kevin. No CEO is responsible for the success of the company. It's about the team that you surround yourself with. And I think that we have an exceptional team, particularly for the size of the business that we have. I joined the company almost 2 years ago because I believe in innovation with a purpose. I believe that we need to find more environmentally sustainable ways to produce seafood and agriculture. And Aqua Bounty is a demonstration of that purpose and that passion of mine. But I am fortunate to work with individuals like David, who has been with the business for 12 years through thick and thin, manages our cash so very effectively, puts the financial strategies that keep us in business in place. We've added Dave Melbourne as our chief commercial officer. I have a commercial background, and I think that's one of the reasons that the board brought me in, is because we were ready for that transition from a technology development company to a commercial environment. But Dave Melbourne's got 25 years of seafood industry experience at consumer marketing. We've got Alejandro Rojas, who is one of the world's foremost experts in terms of raising salmon, specifically in net pens, but more importantly, within a RAS environment, which is not simple. And so having Alejandro as part of that team is really critical. And we now have a general counsel who is both a molecular biologist as well as an attorney who worked for Dow DuPont. And so Angela brings a range of skill sets that allow us to really think about expanding globally and protecting our IP And lastly, we have Dr. Mark Walton, who's a geneticist, who will continue to build on the biotechnology competence that we have today and strengthen that as we go forward. So as you called out, Kevin, and I think it's really important, this is a team that is set up for a much larger business and has the capability and capacity to drive that growth and expansion.
So you touched on an interesting point, and that's international expansion. We've discussed this a little bit in the past, as I have with David. And I understand that you've been working closely with one or two particular potential JV partners in various countries. I was wondering if you might just elaborate on that, make it clear that, to your point about your new GC, that you've got this ability to take your technology and leverage it in other countries that suffer the same situation that the U.S. does as large importers.
Right. So when we look around the world, we're very focused on markets that are similar to the U.S., that they're net importers of salmon. Because again, in a lot of cases, food security is national security. And so we completed field trials in Brazil and just got regulatory approval for our product in Brazil. We have a joint venture partner identified to expand into Israel. And we've been approved for field trials in China, which is outside the United States, the second largest market for salmon. And you think about, it's grown at 16% a year for the last 10 years. So it's a huge opportunity for us. But our strategy is different when we think about expansion internationally than it is in the U.S. In the U.S., we're going to operate our farms because we have the competence to be able to do that effectively in North America. But as we expand globally, we'll be doing that with an operating partner who understands the cultural, regulatory, and commercial aspects that are required for success in those geographies. So we've identified those three markets, and we're putting the pieces in place to be able to move forward with that. But right now, building Farm 3 is absolutely our highest priority in the U.S.
Do you have, sort of a tab on a time frame that might help investors feel a little bit more comfortable about or the milestones to look for in that development?
In terms of Farm 3, the farm in the U.S.?
Yes.
Yeah, David, why don't you share? We do have a number of milestones, starting with harvest in Indiana.
Sure. I think in terms of the current operation, the big milestone that we see in front of us is the first harvest of Aqua Advantage salmon, which is targeted to take place in late October of this year. Now, in parallel with that, we're also executing on our growth plan, which is farm number 3, which will be situated in the United States. And the milestones there include the final selection of the RAS technology provider, which is likely to happen in the next 2 weeks, and then the finalization of the actual site location, which we expect to be able to announce in early October. So those are the big milestones that we have in front of us for the remainder of 2020. But I'll also say that we've got another big milestone on the horizon in early 2021, which is when we expect to put the first shovel in the ground on Farm 3. Because I think that's going to be especially important to investors that see us moving forward on our growth strategy.
Right.
Now, I know we don't have a lot of time, but, and I don't really want the conversation to go in a political direction, but I thought it was really interesting when I saw, and this, Sylvia, you alluded to this, right? Food security is important, right, to national security. I was wondering what sort of support you're finding from the current administration and your development.
We've been really pleased with the support of this administration because they recognize the need for a regulatory approval process that is transparent and predictable, and they've been supportive of our efforts to commercialize. But we also have been building a coalition of support for biotechnology and our salmon specifically, because it really isn't about one administration or the other. It really isn't, to me, the most critical component is the United States needs to be a leader in biotechnology. We are the first and only genetically engineered animal for food, and this country, both sides of the aisle, needs to support that to maintain our leadership globally.
Well, okay, Sylvia, we've gone a little over, and I have a host of questions, but I'll have to leave it to our audience to reach out to you and to David for answers. And again, thank you so much for sharing the screen with me. I really appreciate it. I think you got a great story, and it's really fun to be part of it.
Thanks so much, Kevin. Great to see you.